Psalm 26. You look at Psalm 26. Psalm 26, a fairly basic psalm that a little different from the other psalms. There's a lot of beauty, I think, in the simplicity of these 12 verses. I actually think it's pretty easy to understand. Let's read Psalm 26, if you'll follow along. Vindicate me, O Lord, for I've walked in my integrity, and I've trusted in the Lord without wavering. Examine me, O Lord, and try me. Test my mind and my heart. For your loving kindness is before my eyes, and I've walked in your truth. I do not sit with deceitful men, nor will I go with pretenders. I hate the assembly of evildoers, and I will not sit with the wicked. I shall wash my hands in innocence, and I will go about your altar, O Lord, that I may proclaim with the voice of thanksgiving and declare all your wonders. O Lord, I love the habitation of your house and the place where your glory dwells. Do not take my soul away along with sinners, nor my life with men of bloodshed, in whose hand is a wicked scheme, and whose right hand is full of bribes. But as for me, I shall walk in my integrity. Redeem me and be gracious to me. My foot stands on a level place. In the congregations I shall bless the Lord. You notice at the beginning there, the script above the psalm, it says it's a psalm of David. So here's is David, and he's saying, vindicate me. It's the way the psalm begins. And another way that you could translate vindicate me, the Hebrew word there would be to translate it judge. Judge me, Lord. That's what he's saying. How rare is it to find someone in prayer to God that says, look at me. Test me, Lord. Judge me one way or the other. I'm not in fear of the testing. I'm not in fear of your investigation. My conscience is clear before you, God. That's the way this psalm is given. I think when we're right before God, we can feel the same as well. And our life reveals if that is so, and the choices that we're making reveals whether or not that is so. So if our life is in harmony with God and His will and His word, we would be able to have this same prayer to God as what this psalm is given. Of course, if our life is contrary to what God's word says, we don't want anything to do with being tested or judged before God. And so to outline this psalm, I've put it into, just divided into 3 sections here. And you may divide it a little differently, or you may see spaces in your Bible where it's kind of divided this way already. The first 3 verses deals with David asking for God's testing of his integrity. Verses 4 through 8 deal with the reason for his request and why he could be confident in asking to be tested. And then the psalm ends in the last few verses there where he asks God to separate him from the fate of the wicked. And so the results of that testing are what's talked about there in the last few verses. Let's look at it a little bit more in depth for a few minutes. The first 3 verses, test me for my good. You know, I, as a teacher, school teacher, I loved a good exam. And I think a lot of teachers love exam day, because that's the one day you go, sit down and be quiet and take your test. That's pretty much the only reason behind it. But kids, on the other hand, correct me if I'm wrong, don't like tests. The whole idea behind it, I have to study and prepare, and I have to know the stuff. And the reason they don't like tests is because it's hard. We don't like that, knowing one way or the other whether or not I know it or not. But what we miss is testing actually is for our good. It lets us know where we stand. We don't always look at it that way. We may look at a test in some sort of fashion of negative, but it actually lets me know what do I know and what do I not know. There's nothing wrong with wanting to be tested. And here David is asking God to test him, and he's not saying to send some difficulty on me like Job or something like that. He's not asking for that to verify his faith. That's not the kind of testing that he's talking about. Here in the text, what he's talking about in these first few verses is confidence in his integrity and his character before God. He's very confident in what the results would be. So he can say, vindicate me, O Lord, for I have walked in my integrity, and I've trusted in the Lord without wavering. Examine me, O Lord, and try me. He says, I've trusted in you, Lord, without wavering. So we sing it this way, and it's written, John writes it this way, I know whom I've believed. I know who I serve. I know where I stand. For him to say without gripe, without anything of negative given, I walk in my integrity. He's talking about the way that he lives here. I have a very different view here of a man that stands in confidence before God with what we've been convinced of in the religious world. As much as we may try to stay away from it, we find the infiltration of Calvinistic ideas into our mindset sometimes. And we think about, and we sometimes embrace total depravity. And we think we have just such a decrepit view of man because of it. Now, it's true that when we sin, we fall short of the glory of God. I'm not doubting that. But that does not mean that we should remain in that situation or in that state. When one sins, when one falls, do you just stay in that fallen state, or do you seek to try to do something about it? If I were to fall off these steps, would I just lay here forevermore, or would I try to get up? You see, it's easy to understand what God really wants from us. Yes, we will mess up every now and then. We'll sin. God expects us to get up and to fix the wrongs, correct the wrongs, and seek then to serve Him from that. Change is possible. Give up sin and take on righteousness. And if we do that, we too can walk in our integrity there, as it says in verse 1. There are some that would say you can't do that, that you can't have any impact on you. The Holy Spirit has to do that for you. Another Calvinistic view that makes its way into our way of thinking sometimes. But he's saying here, I walk in my integrity. Either we trust in the Lord or we don't. Either we find ourselves wanting to do His will or we don't. And so he says, I've walked in my integrity. I've trusted in the Lord without wavering. And those things are all together in what he's doing. My trusting in the Lord is why I walk in my integrity without wavering. It doesn't mean that he doesn't sin. It means he doesn't plan to waver. He doesn't plan to sin. We walk in our integrity, and it doesn't mean that this removes the need for God's grace or God's mercy. Absolutely not. Look at verse 11. He says, as for me, I shall walk in my integrity. Redeem me and be gracious to me. You can walk in integrity and still recognize that you need God. And you need God's grace. And you need God's mercy. David did. He was a failure at times. But he recognized that if I'm going to be successful, it's going to be through God. And it's going to be through God's sight. So that he could say, vindicate me or judge me. In the 2 Corinthian letter, Paul writes it this way in chapter 13 and verse 5. Examine yourselves, test yourselves as to whether or not you be in the faith. Testing is for our good. And it's an honorable spirit to have this attitude that David has here, to ask to be tested. And then when you ask to be tested, you need to be willing to accept the results of what that test may prove. So if you test yourself according to God and you find areas you need to change, you've got to be willing to make those changes. David reveals the reason for his request in verses 4 through 8. In verse 4, he says, I do not sit with deceitful men, nor will I go with pretenders. I hate the assembly of evildoers. I will not sit with the wicked. I shall wash my hands in innocence, and I will go about your altar, O Lord, that I may proclaim with the voice of thanksgiving and declare all your wonders. O Lord, I love the habitation of your house and the place where your glory dwells. You see why he's bold in this? He says, test me, vindicate me, judge me, O God, because here's what I've done. Here's how I've lived. I go to the right places and I don't go to the wrong places. I'm with the right people. I'm not with the wrong people. I'm not keeping company with those who are evil doers. Notice he uses these phrases. In verse 4, he says deceitful men and pretenders. In verse 5, he says evildoers. And in verse 5, he says wicked. He said, I don't associate, or we might use it this way, I don't fellowship with that. I'm not spending my life surrounding myself with sin. I'm where I ought to be. I'm at your altar, Lord, worshiping. And I'm in your house, in your habitation, where your glory dwells. I'm confident that I can be tested because of what the test will reveal. He talks about those he's around. He talks about the places that he may go. There's no doubt, and don't misunderstand what I'm saying here, there's no doubt that I will have to be interacting with those that think differently than me and view things right and wrong as different than I do. The world around us it has wickedness everywhere. I may have to interact with that, but I don't find myself being a part of it. I'm going to have to come in contact with that in order to lead others to Christ, like we talked about this morning. That's not the aspect that he's addressing here. What he's talking about is whether or not he's going to be found in this idea of worship. Am I going to be around your altar, Lord, or am I going to be around doing what is wrong? There are immoral gatherings that we should not be a part of. False worship or gatherings today that are not fit for God are not places that we should be. I don't know any nice way to say that. We shouldn't be around places where sin is encouraged, and we shouldn't be around places where sin is laughed at or smiled at. We should stay far away from those places. You're not to be found there if you're seeking to be God, and certainly not there to encourage it. And so rather of encouraging sin and evil doing and those things contrary to God, verse 5, he says, I hate the assembly of evildoers. Not just refrain, I hate that idea. It's not this hate in the sense of dislike and wishing ill will on them. That's not what he's talking about here, but the idea of evil doing, I want to have nothing associated with. And if it has to do with worship in the context here of the psalm, I think there is an idea of worship about it, but how do I treat it? Let's just take it in that lane, if you will. How do I treat my association with those things of false teaching? Do I seek to teach right, identify right, make known what is right? If you can keep a finger here or something and quickly look in 2 Corinthians. I've mentioned it once before, but let's look in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, just real quickly. 2 Corinthians 10 and verse 3, where Paul says, For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but divinely powerful for the destruction of fortresses. We're destroying speculations and every lofty thing raised up against the knowledge of God. We're taking every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. Here's where the battlefield truly lies for us. In words and in teaching, so that we might defeat the schemes of the devil, so that we might give the contrary, the truth, to those that would follow him. We need to take those things into consideration. I'll use the example of Paul. Paul went into the synagogues, didn't he? After he became a Christian, he went into the synagogues. He wasn't afraid to go into the synagogues. I just want to know what he did when he was there. Did he go in to practice with the Jews? Was that his purpose and why he was there? Or did he go in to teach and to reason with them? Would you listen to someone speak that you knew was speaking falsely? Well, that's a loaded question, actually. If I have the opportunity to do so, and I would to listen and to find out what somebody believes and what they teach, and I find it to be wrong, what do? Do I say something? Or do I just bow my head and let it be? There might be a time when we find ourselves in situations where there's something going on that's false or maybe even evil, and the only reason we ought to be in that situation is to battle against it. If I'm unwilling to speak up for what I believe to be truth, I shouldn't find myself in those situations. I shouldn't find myself in those places. Sometimes we'll just simply say, well, I'll attend, but I won't offer fellowship. Well, are you going to do what Paul did or not? David is saying here with passion that I'm against evil. And I'm against what is not right. I'm against the wicked ways. And so he says, I refrain from those evil things. That's why I'm confident, God, that you can judge me. I'm confident that you can test me. I've stayed away from the wrong places. I'm gathering in the right places. And here it's saying the right places are God's altar. in God's house. Look here back in Psalm 26 if you haven't turned back. You notice the idea of altar and sacrifice given in this section. In verse 7, he says that I may proclaim with the voice of thanksgiving and declare all your wonders. That's teaching. That's what he's talking about. I'm declaring that and what's right. And in verse 8, oh Lord, I love the habitation of your house and the place where your glory dwells. How about us? Do we just endure this time together? We just go, I just got to make it through. He said it would be a short sermon tonight. How much longer do you think he's going to go? Is that the way we view it? Do we go, well, I don't even know that I'll even want to be here? Is that our attitude about it? Or do we love them? Are we sincere in our love for them? David knew why he could ask God to judge him. In verses 9 through 12, he says, do not take my soul away along with sinners, nor my life with men of bloodshed, in whose hand is a wicked scheme, and whose right hand is full of bribes. But as for me, I shall walk in my integrity. Redeem me and be gracious to me. My foot stands on a level place. In the congregations I shall bless the Lord. Kind of brings me back and brings the whole psalm back to where he began at the beginning with examine me and see if I be true. If I be true, Lord, save me. That's the way that he ends this song. I don't want to share with the fate of the wicked. I don't want to be with eternity with the sinners. I don't want my soul to be intermingled in that way. And if we fail to realize the fact of what he's saying here, that I need salvation, and I want, when God tests me, to be found right before him. If I fail in that, I'll be with the ungodly for eternity in torment. It's not something small. It's not like going to interview for a job that you think you really want. And if I only got this job, it would be the best one ever. And they call you and they say, no, you didn't get it. And you go, oh, shucks, I don't know what I'll do now. He's talking in eternity here in this sense. And he's saying, I don't want to be with those evildoers for eternity. I don't want to be judged with them. I stand in my integrity, Lord, as to my service to you. In confidence I stand before you in your grace and your mercy. And so I don't want to be with them in life. And I don't want to be with them in death. The way that Jesus puts this in a couple of parables in Matthew chapter 13, just note these quickly. Matthew chapter 13 and verse 40. Matthew 13 and in verse 40. And so they're asking for an explanation of the parable of the tares of the field here in this text. And so Jesus, in explaining it, Matthew 13 verse 40 says, so just as the tares are gathered up and burned with fire, so shall it be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send forth his angels. They'll gather out of his kingdom all stumbling blocks and those who commit lawlessness, and will throw them into the furnace of fire. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And then the righteous will shine forth as the sun in the kingdom of their Father. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. Well, we know that last statement. If you can understand what I'm saying about this, then heed it. That's what he means when he says, he who has ears to hear, let him hear. Make sure you understand and hear this message. In verse 47, he says, again, the kingdom of heaven like a dragnet cast into the sea, gathering fish of every kind. And when it was filled, they drew it up to the beach, and they sat down and gathered the good fish in the containers, but the bad they threw away. So it will be at the end of the age. The angels will come forth and take out of the wicked from among the righteous, and will throw them into the furnace of fire. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Have you understood all these things? That's the way that he puts it. He did not want to leave them misunderstanding what the end judgment was going to be and what lies before each and every one of us one day. There'll be a great gathering one day. And we'll stand before God, and there's going to be a separation that takes place of wicked and righteous. David in this psalm is saying, don't gather my soul with the wicked. Test me and try me, God. I've walked in my integrity before you without wavering. Don't number me with those of the wicked. He says back in Psalm 26 and verse 11, he says, redeem me and be gracious to me. That should be our prayer before God. Redeem me, O Lord, and be gracious to me. And let us never forget that as we bow before God, we bow before Him as sinners, though redeemed. In verse 12, he says, my foot stands on a level place. In other words, he's saying, my footing is not uneven. I know where I stand. I know where I stand with you, O Lord. The contrast to this is seeing how close you can get to the line. I'll get right there on the edge, but I won't step over. Your footing is unsure. We need to be like David here and stand on the level place where you don't plan to slip. I'm not saying David never sinned, but one of the best places that you can find yourself is the end of this psalm. He says, in the congregations, I shall bless the Lord. That's what David wanted to be in the end. He wanted to be with the redeemed for all time. That's where he wanted to be. Is that where we want to be in the end? Is that made manifest in where we like to be now? Do we love the habitation of God's house? God's not going to push you or prod you or force you into heaven. He won't have to. If it's what you want to serve Him, then you will serve Him. If you don't want to be with Him in life, you don't have to worry about being with Him in death. You'll be satisfied. It's your choice, and it's my choice. I want to be with God forever and ever. I want to be separated from Him. Choice is yours. It's the life that we choose to live. We've got a song selected we'll use as an encouragement. If we can help you in your service tonight, let us know as we stand and as we sing.